The mask. The sun dipped low over Charlotte's suburban sprawl, its muted light filtering through the half-drawn blinds of Miles Bishop's home office. The room was pristine as it always was, with every book spine aligned and a neatly coiled phone charger resting on the desk's corner, yet despite its order the space felt hollow, like a museum exhibit that no one visited. Miles leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of an architectural sketch on his desk. It was the layout for a family home, a project he'd been assigned 3 weeks ago. The design was flawless, a wraparound porch, open-concept living room, and a cozy upstairs loft perfect for children. A dream home for someone else, not for him. He set the pencil down and rubbed his temples. The house was due in a week, and every time he thought he'd finished, he found himself starting over. Something wasn't right, though he couldn't name what. The problem wasn't the house, it was him. A sharp knock startled him. Miles turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing at the front door. He hadn't ordered anything, wasn't expecting anyone. The housekeeper came yesterday. Whoever it was, they were an intrusion. The knocking came again, louder this time, persistent. Miles stood slowly, his heart drumming in his chest. He glanced at the coat rack by the door, where his father's old baseball bat leaned. The instinct was automatic, a relic of years spent preparing for worst-case scenarios. He reached for it but stopped himself. "It's just the neighbor," he muttered under his breath. He approached the door cautiously, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floors. Peering through the peephole, he saw a delivery man holding a brown package. Miles exhaled, his shoulders dropping. He opened the door just wide enough to slide the package through. "Thanks," he said curtly, not meeting the man's eyes before closing the door again. Back in the living room, he stared at the box. No return address. His name scrawled in bold black marker across the top. Miles frowned. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and sliced it open, revealing a single photograph inside. It was a picture of him. At least it looked like him, a boy of 12, standing barefoot on a patchy lawn. His shirt was torn, his lips split, and his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had already seen too much. Miles's hand tightened around the photo, his breathing shallow. Memories he'd long buried clawed their way back to the surface. The sound of his father's voice, slurred and venomous, the shattering of glass against a wall, his mother's sobs muffled by closed doors. "Stop it," he hissed, dropping the photo onto the coffee table. But the image lingered in his mind, pulling him under. Nia Morgan's morning started the same way every day. Alarm at 6, coffee at 6:30, out the door by 7. Predictable, controlled, safe. She sipped her latte as she crossed the intersection near Lakeshore Drive, the city buzzing with its usual rhythm. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, a text from her coworker. "You're covering second period, right?" Nia sighed and slipped the phone back into her pocket. It wasn't the first time someone had dumped extra work on her. She didn't complain. It was easier not to, but sometimes she wished someone would notice how much she gave. The bell rang as she entered the high school, the corridors filling with chatter and slamming lockers. Nia made her way to her office, a small but welcoming space adorned with motivational posters and student artwork. "Ms. Morgan?" A timid voice interrupted her thoughts. Nia turned to see Destiny, one of her sophomore students, hovering in the doorway. "Come in," Nia said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. Destiny sat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I don't think I can do the presentation tomorrow. Everyone's gonna laugh at me." Nia leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Why do you think that?" "Because they always do," Destiny whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. Nia's chest tightened. She recognized the fear in the girl's voice, the same fear that had paralyzed her at Destiny's age. She wanted to tell Destiny it would get better, that the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed, but that would be a lie. Instead, she said, "People laugh when they don't understand, but that doesn't mean your voice isn't worth hearing." Destiny nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I'll try." After the girl left, Nia leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The advice she gave her students came so easily, yet she couldn't take it herself. She hadn't shared her voice in years, not since that night. The night she stopped being a girl and became a ghost. The photograph haunted him. Miles sat on the edge of his couch, the picture of his younger self still lying on the coffee table. He hadn't touched it again, but its presence gnawed at him, demanding attention. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. The streets outside were quiet now, a calm that made him feel more restless. He reached for the bottle of bourbon, sitting on the kitchen counter. He poured a splash into a glass, then hesitated. For a long moment he stared at the amber liquid, his grip tightening. "No," he muttered, setting the glass down with a sharp clink. Instead, he grabbed the photo and marched upstairs, as if movement alone could keep the memories at bay. He flipped the light on in his bedroom. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, a bed, a dresser, a nightstand. The only personal touch was a framed certificate from his architecture school, its corners beginning to yellow. Miles tossed the photograph onto the dresser, his jaw clenching as he looked at it. He told himself it was just an old picture, nothing more. But the longer he stared, the more he saw. The boy in the photo wasn't just battered, he was broken, the same way Miles had been that night. It had started like all the others. His father came home late, the scent of whiskey trailing him like a shadow. Miles was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a comic book, praying tonight would be different. "Boy?" his father barked from the doorway. Miles froze. He closed the comic and stood, careful not to meet his father's eyes. "Yes, sir?" "Where's your mother?" "She's in the kitchen." The sound of his father's boots crossing the hardwood floor was a rhythm Miles knew too well. He stayed rooted in place, his small frame trembling as the shouting began. "You spend my money, and I come home to this mess?" his father roared. There was a crash, the sound of dishes shattering. Miles flinched but didn't move. He'd learned long ago that stepping in only made things worse. But when his mother screamed, something inside him snapped. He ran into the kitchen, his breath hitching as he saw his mother crouched on the floor, clutching her arm. His father loomed over her, his hand raised for another strike. "Stop!" Miles shouted. His father turned, his face twisted with rage. "What did you say to me?" Miles' heart pounded, but he didn't back down. "I said stop!" The blow came faster than he expected. Pain exploded in his cheek as he hit the floor. His mother screamed again, but this time it wasn't for herself. "Leave him alone!" she cried. But his father didn't stop. He grabbed Miles by the collar, lifting him like a rag doll. "You think you're a man now?" Miles didn't answer. He couldn't. His father threw him against the wall and the world went dark. Miles blinked, the memory dissolving like smoke. He realized his hands were shaking, his breathing shallow. He clenched his fists, willing himself to calm down. "It's in the past," he whispered. But the past never really left. He sat down heavily on the bed, staring at the photo on the dresser. For years, he'd kept his life meticulously controlled, building walls around himself to keep the darkness out. But the walls were cracking, and he wasn't sure how much longer they'd hold. Nia sat at her desk, her hands hovering over her laptop keyboard. She'd been staring at a blank Word document for over an hour, the blinking cursor mocking her. The open mic was next weekend, and she'd promised herself she'd perform. But every time she tried to write, the words got stuck in her throat, like a scream she couldn't let out. She closed the laptop with a sigh and leaned back in her chair. Her apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, the city buzzed with life, but Nia felt detached from it, like she was watching it all through a pane of glass. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her cousin, Layla. "You better be coming to the cookout next Sunday. No excuses." Nia smiled faintly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She hadn't been to a family gathering in months, always finding some reason to skip. Layla wouldn't let her off the hook this time. "I'll try," she typed back. But even as she sent the message, her chest tightened at the thought. Being around family meant questions. Questions she didn't want to answer. "When are you going to settle down? Why don't you have kids yet? What happened to that nice guy you were seeing?" They didn't understand. How could they? Nia stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about Destiny, the student who had come to her office that morning. The girl reminded her of herself at that age, full of potential, but weighed down by fear. People laugh when they don't understand. The words she'd spoken to Destiny echoed in her mind. She wanted to believe them, but she wasn't sure she could. Her gaze shifted to the bookshelf in the corner, where an old leather-bound diary sat. She hadn't opened it in years, not since the night everything changed. Before she could stop herself, she crossed the room and grabbed the diary. Her hands trembled as she flipped it open, the pages filled with the handwriting of a girl she barely recognized. One page in particular caught her eye. The ink was smudged, as if the words had been written in a hurry. "He said he'd take care of me. He lied." Nia slammed the diary shut, her breath hitching. The memories she'd buried for so long surged to the surface, threatening to drown her. But this time she didn't run. This time, she let herself feel. The next morning, Miles woke to the sound of rain tapping against his bedroom window. He sat up slowly, groaning as he rubbed the stiffness from his neck. He hadn't slept well. He never did after nights when the memories crept in. The photograph still lay on the dresser, its edges curling slightly. Miles avoided looking at it as he pulled on a sweatshirt and jeans. He needed air, a distraction, something to pull him out of his head. Downstairs, the house was as quiet as ever. Too quiet. Miles grabbed his keys and stepped outside, the cool rain misting his face. He didn't care. He drove aimlessly for a while, the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers providing a strange kind of comfort. Eventually, he found himself at a park on the edge of town. The trails were empty, the playground deserted. Perfect. Miles parked and walked toward the woods, the crunch of gravel under his boots grounding him. The rain had turned to a drizzle by the time he reached the trailhead. He shoved his hands into his pockets and started walking, his mind buzzing with fragments of memories and questions he didn't want to answer. Why now? Why that picture? Who sent it? Miles stopped abruptly, his breath catching as a thought hit him. His mother. She was the only one who might have kept the photo. But why would she send it now, after all these years? His chest tightened. He hadn't spoken to her in almost 5 years. Not since the last time he visited her and found her living in the same rundown house where it all happened. She'd refused to leave, no matter how much he begged her. "This is my home, Miles," she'd said, her voice weary but resolute. But it wasn't a home, not for him. It was a tomb filled with ghosts he couldn't face. Miles leaned against a tree, closing his eyes as the rain dampened his hair. He needed answers, but the thought of calling her made his stomach churn. What if she didn't want to talk, or worse, what if she did? He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over her number. His finger twitched, but he couldn't press it. Instead, he shoved the phone back into his pocket and kept walking. Nia sat in her car outside the bookstore, staring at the brightly lit entrance. Inside, people milled about, chatting and laughing as they browsed the shelves. The open mic night had already started. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She'd told herself she would do it this time, that she'd share her poem and finally break through the wall she'd built around herself. But now, sitting here, the fear was louder than ever. What if they don't like it? What if they laugh? What if I freeze? Nia sighed, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel. She thought of Destiny, the girl who had looked to her for guidance. Nia had told her to be brave, to use her voice. But how could she expect Destiny to believe her if she couldn't even believe in herself? Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Layla again. "Don't flake, I know you can do this." Nia bit her lip, her chest tightening. She could almost hear Layla's voice, equal parts encouraging and relentless. With a deep breath, she grabbed her notebook from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, the rain from earlier leaving the pavement glistening under the streetlights. Inside, the bookstore was warm and bustling. A small stage had been set up in the corner, and a young man was reading a poem about heartbreak and renewal. Nia hovered near the back, clutching her notebook like a lifeline. "Are you signing up?" a woman at the sign-up table asked, smiling warmly. Nia hesitated, her heart pounding. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she nodded. The woman handed her a number. "You'll go after the next person." Nia's stomach churned as she sat down, flipping through her notebook. She knew the poem by heart, but the words felt heavy, like they might collapse under the weight of her fear. When her number was called, her legs felt like lead as she walked to the stage. The microphone loomed before her, its presence both inviting and terrifying. She glanced at the crowd, her vision blurring slightly. Nia took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she opened her notebook. The first words came out shaky, but she kept going. "I was 16 when I lost my voice," she began. The room fell silent. Not because I couldn't speak, but because I wasn't heard. I screamed, and the world turned away. I cried, and the silence swallowed me whole. Her voice grew steadier as she continued, the words pouring out like a dam breaking. "But here I am, still standing, still fighting, because I am more than what happened to me. I am more than my fear, and so are you." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Nia stood there for a moment, stunned. She felt lighter, as if she'd finally put down a weight she'd been carrying for years. As she stepped off the stage, a woman in the audience stopped her. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that." Nia smiled, her chest swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time, pride. Miles stared at his phone for a long moment before finally hitting call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, groggy and faintly irritated. "Hello?" His mother's voice hadn't changed, though it carried an undercurrent of exhaustion that made his stomach twist. "Hey, Ma, it's me." "Miles?" Her tone sharpened with surprise, then softened into something wary. "It's been a while." "Yeah, I know," he said, pacing his living room. I wasn't sure if I should call, but I got something in the mail yesterday. A photo. Of me. From when I was a kid." Silence hung between them. "You sent it, didn't you?" he pressed, the weight of the question heavy in his voice. "I did," she admitted after a pause. "I didn't know if you'd look at it or just throw it away, but I had to try." Miles clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the phone. "Why now? Why dig this up after all these years? Because you've been running, Miles, from me, from your past, from everything, she said, her voice laced with a mix of frustration and sadness. You can't keep shutting people out. You're my son, and I see how much this has cost you. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He sank onto the couch, one hand running through his hair. I'm fine, he said, though even to his own ears the words sounded hollow. No, you're not, she softened. You can't bury this forever, it'll eat you alive. Miles sat in silence, staring at the photograph on the coffee table. The boy in the picture stared back at him, a mirror of everything he didn't want to face. I don't know how, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Start small, she said gently. Talk to someone, a therapist maybe, someone who can help you carry this. You don't have to do it alone. Miles scoffed, though there was no real heat behind it. Therapy? You know how people like us see that? His mother sighed. I know, but look where avoiding it has gotten us. The line went quiet again. For the first time, Miles felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He thought of the years he'd spent building walls around himself, the relationships he'd pushed away, the life he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. Okay, he said finally, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. I'll think about it. That's all I ask, she said softly. Nia stared at the email on her laptop screen. It was from a therapist Layla had recommended months ago, a name she'd saved but never contacted. Hi, Nia. I'm glad to hear you're interested in exploring therapy. I have openings on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Let me know what works for you. Her finger hovered over the mouse, debating whether to delete the message or reply. The open mic night had been a breakthrough, but it was just the beginning. She'd felt the rush of sharing her voice, the catharsis of putting her pain into words. But the high had faded quickly, leaving her with the same questions she'd been avoiding for years. She thought of the diary on her shelf, the pages she hadn't dared to revisit. She thought of the girl she'd been at 16, trusting and wide-eyed, unaware of how easily that trust could be shattered. And she thought of the woman she wanted to be, the woman she was trying to become. With a deep breath, she clicked reply. Miles sat stiffly in the therapist's office, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room was cozy, with soft lighting and a shelf filled with books and plants, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. The therapist, a middle-aged man named Dr. Harris, smiled warmly. Thanks for coming in, Miles. I know it's not easy to take this step. Miles shrugged, his gaze fixed on the floor. My mom thought it was a good idea. And what do you think? I don't know, he admitted. I guess I don't want to keep feeling like this. Like what? Dr. Harris prompted. Miles hesitated. The words felt heavy in his throat, but he forced them out, angry, tired, like there's this weight I can't get rid of no matter what I do. Dr. Harris nodded, his expression calm and understanding. That's a good place to start. Tell me about the weight. Where do you think it comes from? Miles stared at his hands, the image of the photograph flashing in his mind. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Nia's therapist, Dr. Caldwell, had suggested something unexpected during their third session. You've been talking about reconnecting with your creative side, she said. Have you ever considered joining a group? Something that lets you share and listen with others who might understand what you're going through. Nia frowned. Like a support group? Not quite, Dr. Caldwell said with a small smile. There's a community workshop series at the Cultural Center downtown. It's for African American professionals who want to explore healing through art, storytelling, and discussion. It might be a good space to share and listen without pressure. The idea intrigued her. She'd been surprised by how freeing the open mic had been, and maybe a structured group could help her keep pushing forward. When does it start? Next Thursday. Miles, meanwhile, had reluctantly agreed to Dr. Harris's suggestion to try something outside of his comfort zone. I'm not saying it'll solve everything, Dr. Harris had said, but engaging with others in a positive, intentional space can be a way to chip at that isolation you've been feeling. Miles had nearly laughed at the irony. He was fine alone. That's what he kept telling himself anyway. But something about Dr. Harris's tone made him consider it. What kind of space? There's a workshop series at the Cultural Center downtown. Creative healing, they call it. It's for professionals like you who might not want a formal group but still want a place to share. Miles had hesitated. Creative healing wasn't exactly in his wheelhouse. But the words positive space lingered in his mind. He'd spent so long in negative ones, maybe it wouldn't hurt to try something new. When does it start? Next Thursday. Nia arrived early, clutching her notebook like a shield as she stepped into the bright open space. The room was filled with scattered chairs and tables, and a few people milled around sipping coffee and chatting. She made her way to an empty seat in the back, her eyes scanning the room. A tall man with broad shoulders and a hesitant air caught her attention. He stood near the doorway, looking like he was debating whether to stay or leave. Miles adjusted the strap of his leather satchel, his eyes darting across the room. He didn't know why he'd agreed to this. The space was too open, the faces too unfamiliar, but something about the low hum of conversation and the faint smell of coffee reminded him of simpler days. He spotted an empty chair near the back and made his way toward it. He glanced briefly at the woman sitting beside it, a striking woman with deep brown eyes and an air of quiet intensity. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. Nia looked up, startled. She shook her head. "No, go ahead." He nodded and sat, dropping his bag beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, both scanning the room without really seeing it. A facilitator stepped to the front of the room and clapped her hands. "Welcome, everyone. My name is Camille, and I'll be leading this series. Tonight, we're focusing on introductions and grounding. We'll start with a simple exercise, sharing your name and why you're here. No pressure to go too deep, just whatever feels right." Nia's stomach flipped. She wasn't sure she was ready to explain herself to a room full of strangers. Miles crossed his arms, already regretting his decision. Sharing wasn't his thing. One by one, the participants introduced themselves. The stories varied. Some were lighthearted, others deeply personal. When it was Nia's turn, she took a deep breath. "I'm Nia," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I'm here because I'm trying to figure out how to stop letting my past control my future, and writing has always been my way of doing that." Miles glanced at her, surprised by the openness in her tone. When it was his turn, he hesitated, then cleared his throat. "I'm Miles," he said simply. "And, I guess I'm just here to figure out what the hell I'm doing with my life." A ripple of laughter moved through the group, breaking the tension. Even Nia smiled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. As the session continued, they found themselves paired together for a small group activity. The task was to share a memory that shaped them, an early moment that left a mark, good or bad. Nia hesitated before speaking. "When I was 16, I trusted someone I shouldn't have," she said carefully. It changed the way I see the world, and it's something I've been trying to unlearn ever since." Miles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I get that," he said. "For me, it was my dad. He wasn't a great guy, and I guess I've spent most of my life trying not to be him." Their eyes met, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "Funny how the past never really stays in the past, huh?" Nia said with a faint smile. Miles chuckled softly. "Yeah, but maybe it doesn't have to define us either." For the first time in a long while, they both felt a spark of connection, not just to the group, but to each other. The second session of the workshop series was titled "The Masks We Wear." Camille explained the theme as she gestured toward a table stacked with art supplies, paints, markers, paper, and clay. "Tonight we'll be exploring the masks we present to the world," she said. "What we show, what we hide, and what we protect. Your task is to create a mask, either literal or symbolic, that represents these parts of yourself." The participants glanced at one another, their initial excitement dampened by the vulnerability required. Nia stared at the blank canvas in front of her. Art wasn't her strong suit, but she liked the idea of creating something tangible to express what she couldn't say out loud. She picked up a pencil and started sketching, the lines tentative at first but growing bolder as images formed in her mind. Miles sat across from her, arms crossed. He stared at the materials as though they were a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. "Not your thing?" Nia asked softly. He glanced up, surprised she'd spoken to him. "I'm not much of an artist." "Neither am I," she admitted, holding up her drawing. It was rough and unfinished, but the shapes of a woman's face were visible, half bright and open, half shrouded in shadow. Miles studied it for a moment, then reached for a sheet of paper. "Okay," he said. "I'll give it a shot." As the session progressed, the room buzzed with quiet concentration. Nia lost herself in the process, layering colors and textures to capture the duality she felt within herself. When Camille called time, everyone was invited to share their work. Nia's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to stand, holding her mask up for the group to see. "This is me," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "The bright side is what I show the world, confident, capable, strong. But the shadow, that's the part I keep hidden, the fear, the shame, the things I haven't forgiven myself for." The group listened intently, their expressions a mix of empathy and understanding. When it was Miles's turn, he held up his mask, a rough but striking piece with jagged edges and bold, dark colors. "This is mine," he said. "It's not pretty, but I guess that's the point. The cracks are the things I've been through, the things I've tried to cover up. But the more I try to hide them, the more obvious they get. Nia watched him closely, surprised by his candor. After everyone had shared, Camille spoke. What I love about this exercise is that it shows us how much we all carry, even if it looks different, and sometimes sharing that weight, letting others see it, can make it a little lighter. As the group began packing up, Nia found herself lingering near Miles. Your mask, she said, gesturing toward it. It's raw, honest, I liked it. He shrugged, but there was a faint smile on his lips. Yours was good too. Makes me think we're all just patchwork people trying to make sense of the pieces. Maybe that's the point, she said. For the first time, they shared a quiet laugh, the beginnings of a fragile connection forming between them. By the fourth session, the group had become more comfortable with one another. Camille had asked everyone to bring in something meaningful, a song, poem, object, or photo that represented their journey. Nia brought her notebook, flipping to a poem she'd written after the open mic night. I called this Unbroken, she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. It's about surviving even when you think you can't. As she read, her words hung heavy in the air, painting a vivid picture of pain and resilience. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the group erupted into applause. Miles clapped along with the others, feeling something shift within him. He'd brought a photo, a weathered snapshot of himself as a boy, standing next to his father. This picture reminds me of who I don't want to be, he said when it was his turn. But it also reminds me of how far I've come. I've spent so much time running from him, from the things he did, that I forgot I have the power to be different. His words struck a chord with Nia. After the session, she approached him again, this time with more confidence. You've got a way with words, she said. So do you, he replied. They walked out together, their conversation flowing easily. For the first time, they began to see not just each other, but themselves, in a new light. The workshops had a way of leaving Nia and Miles raw and reflective. They often lingered after sessions, chatting as the rest of the group dispersed. One evening, after a particularly intense discussion about forgiveness, Nia hesitated by the door. You hungry? She asked, surprising herself as much as him. Miles blinked, then shrugged. I could eat. They found a diner a few blocks away, the kind with sticky vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Over plates of fries and burgers, the conversation turned personal. You ever feel like you're just stuck? Nia asked, stirring her milkshake. All the time, Miles admitted. But I guess I never thought about what being unstuck would even look like. She nodded, her gaze distant. Me neither. It's like I've been living in this bubble telling myself I'm fine, but deep down I know I'm not. Miles leaned back, his arms crossed. What's stopping you? From breaking out of it? She met his eyes, the question hanging heavy between them. Same thing that stops everyone, I guess. Fear. Their dinners became a habit. Each week after the workshop, they'd find a new spot. Sometimes a coffee shop, sometimes a quiet park bench if the weather was nice. Their conversations were a strange mix of light and heavy, shared laughs about awkward moments in the group, followed by deep dives into their respective pasts. One evening, after a particularly long conversation about family, Nia pulled a photo from her wallet and slid it across the table. My sister, she said. She's the only one I've kept in touch with. She doesn't know everything, but she knows enough. Miles studied the photo, a younger version of Nia smiling brightly beside a teenage girl with the same deep brown eyes. She looks like she has your fire. She does, Nia said softly. She's the one who keeps pushing me to heal, says I owe it to myself to stop hiding. What about you? She asked. Any siblings? Miles shook his head. Just me. My mom and I are close, but it's complicated. Isn't it always? They shared a knowing smile, the kind born from mutual understanding. One Friday, as they walked to their cars after dinner, Nia hesitated. Do you ever think about doing something just reckless? She asked, stopping under a streetlight. Miles raised an eyebrow. Reckless like what? I don't know. Something completely out of character, just to see what it feels like. He smirked. You've got something in mind, don't you? She laughed, a sound that felt freer than she'd expected. Maybe, but only if you're up for it. Try me. An hour later, they found themselves at an indoor rock climbing gym. Climbing? Miles asked, staring up at the wall. This is your idea of reckless? Nia grinned. You said try me. He sighed, shaking his head. All right, but if I break something, you're paying my hospital bill. They strapped into their harnesses, the staff offering instructions they only half heard in their excitement. Nia went first, her determination outweighing her fear as she scaled the brightly colored holds. "Come on, Miles," she called down, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. He followed, grumbling under his breath but secretly enjoying the challenge. When they both reached the top, they sat on the edge of the platform, their legs dangling over the side. "Okay," Miles admitted, catching his breath. "This was a good idea." Nia laughed, the sound echoing around them. For a moment she forgot about the weight of her past, the shadows she carried. Sitting beside her, Miles felt the same lightness, a fleeting sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Their friendship deepened over the following weeks, each of them pushing the other to take small steps outside their comfort zones. For Nia, it was submitting one of her poems to a local literary magazine. She'd hesitated for days, but Miles had refused to let her back out. "They'd be lucky to publish you," he'd said, his tone so earnest it left her momentarily speechless. For Miles, it was visiting his father's grave, a place he'd avoided since the funeral. Nia went with him, standing silently by his side as he wrestled with the emotions he'd buried for years. "It's okay to be angry," she told him afterward, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "But it's also okay to let it go." He nodded, her words settling deep in his chest. Their connection was still tentative, filled with unspoken questions and lingering fears. But for the first time, both Nia and Miles felt like they were moving towards something real, something worth fighting for. Nia sat at her desk late one night, her notebook open to a blank page. The soft glow of her lamp illuminated the cluttered surface, pens, coffee cups, and half-finished drafts of poems. She stared at the empty lines, willing the words to come. The poem she wanted to write wasn't for anyone else. It wasn't for a magazine, a workshop, or an open mic. It was for her. She thought about her sister, the nights they'd spent whispering in the dark, planning futures they'd never imagined would fracture. Her sister had been her anchor when everything else felt adrift. Now, miles apart, their phone calls felt like lifelines. Her pen hovered over the page. Slowly, she began to write. "For the girl who held me when the world broke apart, whose laughter was a shield against the dark." The words flowed like a tide breaking free. By the time she stopped, the page was full, and her heart felt a little lighter. Across town, Miles sat on his living room floor, sorting through a box of old photos. His mother had given it to him months ago, but he hadn't been ready to face it until now. One photo caught his eye, a picture of his father holding him as a baby, both of them laughing. He frowned, turning the photo over in his hands. He had no memory of that day, no context for the joy on his father's face. Dr. Harris's words from their last session echoed in his mind. Healing doesn't mean excusing someone's actions. It means understanding their impact and choosing how to move forward. Miles set the photo aside and pulled out a notebook. Writing wasn't something he did often, but it was something he'd picked up from Nia. He scribbled a few lines, pausing to reread them. "You were a storm I couldn't outrun, but even storms leave clear skies behind." He wasn't sure if it was a poem or a confession, but it felt like progress. One of Nia's greatest fears had always been public vulnerability. She could pour her soul into a poem but balked at the idea of sharing it with strangers. At the next workshop, Camille announced an opportunity to perform at a community showcase. "It's completely optional," she said, "but I think it could be a powerful experience for those ready to take the leap." Nia felt Miles's eyes on her. "You should do it," he said. She shook her head. "I don't know if I can." "Of course you can. You've done harder things." The simple statement lingered in her mind. That night, she signed up. Miles faced his own challenge when his mother called, asking him to join her for a family gathering. He hadn't been to one in years, preferring to keep his distance from the people who reminded him of his father. "You can't avoid them forever," Nia said when he mentioned it. "Maybe it's time to let them see the real you." The idea terrified him, but he knew she was right. At the community showcase, Nia's hands trembled as she stepped onto the stage. The audience blurred into a faceless crowd under the bright lights, but she focused on the microphone, grounding herself. "This is called Unbroken," she began, her voice steady despite the rapid beat of her heart. As she read, the fear melted away, replaced by a quiet strength. When she finished, the applause was deafening, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the feeling of release, of reclaiming a piece of herself. Miles was in the front row, clapping louder than anyone else. At the family gathering, Miles stood by the buffet table, resisting the urge to leave. He felt like a stranger among people who'd known him his entire life. His aunt approached, her smile warm. "We've missed you," she said simply. He nodded, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. Later, when his mother hugged him goodbye, she whispered, "I'm proud of you." For the first time, he believed her. Nia and Miles continued to push themselves in small but meaningful ways. Nia started submitting her work to more publications, even receiving her first acceptance letter. Miles began volunteering at a youth center, sharing his story with boys who reminded him of his younger self. Their paths weren't linear, and the shadows of their past still lingered. But with each step forward, they felt a little lighter, a little braver. Together, they were learning that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one they didn't have to walk alone. It started with a phone call. Miles was at the youth center sorting through donated books when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his mother. "What's up?" he asked, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder. "I found some of your dad's old things," she said, her voice hesitant. "A box in the attic. I thought you might want it." Miles froze. He thought he'd seen the last of his father's belongings after the funeral. "What's in it?" "I didn't go through it," she admitted, "but it felt like something you should decide about." He promised to come by that evening, but as he hung up, a familiar dread settled in his chest. Nia's breaking point came 2 days later when she received an email from the literary magazine she'd submitted to. She clicked it with trembling fingers, her heart soaring when she saw the words, "We're thrilled to publish your poem in our next issue." But as the initial excitement faded, fear took its place. What if people didn't like it? What if they judged her for writing about her pain? She stared at the email, unable to celebrate. That night, Nia and Miles met at the park, as they often did when the weight of life felt too heavy. The air was cool, the faint scent of rain lingering in the breeze. Miles spoke first. "My mom found some of my dad's stuff. She wants me to take it." "How do you feel about that?" Nia asked. He hesitated. "Like I'm not ready, like I'll never be ready." She nodded, understanding. "I got an email today. My poem's getting published." "That's amazing," Miles said, his face lighting up. "It is," she agreed, "but it's also terrifying. What if people read it and see too much? What if they don't understand?" They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their fears settling between them. Finally, Miles spoke. "What if facing the stuff we're afraid of is the only way to let it go?" Nia glanced at him, surprised by his insight. "You think so?" He shrugged. "Maybe. I don't know, but I think I'm tired of running." The next day, Miles drove to his mother's house. She met him at the door, a small cardboard box in her hands. "I'll leave you alone," she said, her voice soft as she handed it to him. He took the box to his car, his hands trembling as he lifted the lid. Inside, he found an assortment of items, a leather wallet, a watch, a stack of letters tied with twine. One letter caught his eye, addressed to him in his father's scrawled handwriting, to Miles. He hesitated, his heart pounding, but then he unfolded the paper. "Son, I know I wasn't the man you needed me to be. I'm sorry for the ways I hurt you, for the things I couldn't fix in myself. You deserve better, and I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me, not for me, but for you, because carrying hate is too heavy a load." Tears blurred Miles's vision as he read. For the first time, he allowed himself to grieve, not just for the father he'd lost, but for the relationship they never had. That same evening, Nia sat at her desk, staring at her poem. She thought about all the people who might read it, the judgments they might make. But then she thought about the girl she used to be, the girl who needed to know it was okay to hurt, okay to heal. She opened her social media and posted a snippet of the poem, captioned simply, "For anyone who feels like they're not enough, you are." Her phone buzzed almost immediately with likes and comments, but it wasn't the validation that mattered. What mattered was the freedom she felt in finally letting herself be seen. For both Nia and Miles, those moments marked a shift. They weren't healed, not completely, but they'd taken steps toward the light, steps that felt irreversible. When they met at the park later that week, they didn't need to say much. Their shared silence was a comfort, a testament to how far they'd come. "You faced it," Nia said finally, her voice tinged with pride. "So did you," Miles replied. And for the first time, they both believed they could keep moving forward, together and apart. The air smelled like spring, fresh grass, and budding flowers. As Nia sat in her living room, scanning an invitation on her phone, it was for a community poetry night, this time organized by one of her literary heroes. The idea of performing in front of such an audience thrilled her as much as it terrified her. Nia bit her lip, glancing at the clock. She'd told Miles about the event weeks ago, but now, standing on the threshold of opportunity, self-doubt crept back in. She texted him, "Should I go for it?" The reply was immediate. "You already know the answer." She smiled. He had a way of cutting through her hesitations without pressuring her. Miles, meanwhile, stood outside the youth center, staring at a sign announcing a mentoring program expansion. Camille had asked him to lead a series of workshops for at-risk boys, something that felt far outside his comfort zone. "What's stopping you?" she'd asked during their last group session. Miles had shrugged, masking his uncertainty with indifference. "I'm not exactly a role model." Camille's laugh had been knowing. "You don't have to be perfect, Miles. You just have to show up." The words stuck with him as he weighed the decision. That Friday, Nia stood backstage at the poetry night, gripping the mic stand as she prepared to step into the spotlight. The crowd was bigger than anything she'd faced before, a mix of familiar faces and strangers. She glanced toward the audience, spotting Miles near the back. He gave her a thumbs up, his encouragement a steadying force. Her voice trembled as she began, but by the second stanza, she found her rhythm. The poem wasn't just words on a page anymore, it was her truth, spoken aloud. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. She stepped off the stage, her cheeks flushed with exhilaration. "See?" Miles said as she joined him. "Told you you'd kill it." She laughed, the sound light and carefree. "I almost didn't come. But you did," he reminded her. The next morning, Miles arrived at the youth center early, his nerves coiled tight. His first mentoring session felt monumental, the weight of expectation pressing down on him. The boys trickled in slowly, their guarded expressions mirroring the walls he'd once built around himself. "All right," he began, clearing his throat. "Let's talk about what it means to carry your story, the good, the bad, and everything in between." As he spoke, sharing pieces of his own journey, he saw their postures soften, their eyes shift from skeptical to curious. By the end of the session, one boy lingered, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Thanks for today," he mumbled before hurrying out the door. Miles stood there for a moment, the small exchange filling him with a quiet sense of purpose. Nia and Miles continued to support each other, their lives branching out in ways they hadn't anticipated. For Nia, success brought new challenges. She was invited to speak at workshops, her poetry becoming a voice for those who felt unseen. But with each step forward, she grappled with imposter syndrome, questioning if she truly belonged. For Miles, mentoring became a lifeline, but it also forced him to confront the parts of himself he'd buried. As he guided the boys, he realized how much he still had to learn about forgiveness and self-acceptance. Through it all, they leaned on each other. Late-night calls, impromptu meetups, and quiet moments of reflection became their rituals. One evening, they met at a quiet cafe, the hum of conversation around them a comforting backdrop. "I think I want to write a book," Nia said suddenly, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Miles leaned back, smiling. "What about?" "About us. Not just you and me, but people like us. People who are afraid to face their past but do it anyway." "That sounds powerful," he said, nodding. She hesitated. "I was thinking, maybe we could work on it together. Your perspective would make it real in a way I can't do alone." Miles raised an eyebrow. "You want me to write?" "Why not? You've got stories worth telling." He laughed, the sound low and warm. "All right, I'm in. But don't blame me if my parts are terrible. I'll make you sound brilliant," she promised. Together they embarked on a new project, pouring their experiences into words that they hoped would resonate with others. It wasn't just about creating something meaningful. It was about continuing to heal, to grow, and to prove to themselves and others that it was never too late to start over. Nia and Miles met weekly to brainstorm for their book, alternating between her cozy living room and his quiet dining room table. They'd scatter papers, notebooks, and laptops, their creative energy filling the space. The process wasn't without its challenges. "You can't just skip over that part," Nia said one evening, pointing to a section of Miles's draft. "This is the heart of your story." Miles frowned. "I'm not ready to go into all that." She softened. "You don't have to rush it. But if we're going to help people, we need to show them the messy parts too. That's where the healing happens." He nodded, jotting down a note to revisit the section later. On the flip side, Nia struggled to keep her inner critic at bay. "This is terrible," she muttered one afternoon, staring at her screen. "Why did I think I could do this?" Miles glanced up from his notebook. "Because you can. Stop overthinking and just write." She sighed, but his calm reassurance steadied her. "Fine, but if this flops, you're taking half the blame." "Deal," he said with a grin. As they delved deeper into the project, both Nia and Miles found themselves revisiting memories they'd long avoided. One night, Miles wrote about his father's absence during his high school graduation. He described the empty chair in the audience, the forced smile he wore as he accepted his diploma. When he read the passage to Nia, his voice cracked. "You've carried that for so long," she said softly. "Yeah," he admitted, but writing it down, it feels like letting some of it go. Nia, in turn, tackled a chapter about her childhood. She described the day her father left, the echo of the slammed door, and the way her mother's tears became her lullaby that night. When she shared it with Miles, her hands trembled. "You were just a kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve any of that." "I know," she whispered, "but sometimes it's easier to blame myself than to accept that." Their progress wasn't without outside obstacles. Nia received pushback from a literary agent who suggested their book might be too niche to find a broad audience. "Too niche?" she ranted to Miles. "Black pain and healing aren't niche." Miles agreed. "If anything, it's universal. Everyone has something they're running from." The rejection only fueled their determination to keep going. Meanwhile, Miles faced criticism from an old acquaintance who dismissed his involvement in the project as too soft for a man. "Helping people heal isn't soft," Nia said when he told her. "It's brave. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Months into the process, they finally completed the first draft. "This is it," Nia said, her voice tinged with disbelief as she scrolled through the final pages. Miles leaned back, exhaling deeply. "I didn't think we'd actually finish." They celebrated with takeout and wine, reflecting on how far they'd come, not just with the book, but in their personal journeys. "Writing this, it forced me to face things I didn't even realize I was avoiding," Miles admitted. "Same," Nia said, "but it also reminded me how much strength we have when we stop running." The process of editing and pitching the book was grueling, but it brought new opportunities for growth. Nia found herself speaking at panels about the intersection of art and mental health, her confidence growing with each appearance. Miles began hosting workshops at the youth center, incorporating lessons from their book into his sessions. Together, they saw the impact their words had on others. Readers reached out to share their own stories, thanking them for their honesty. "I never thought I'd inspire anyone," Miles said one day, reading an email from a young man who credited him with finding the courage to start therapy. Nia smiled. "You inspire me every day." By the time their book was published, Nia and Miles had transformed, not into perfect versions of themselves, but into people unafraid to face life head-on. At the book launch, they stood side by side, answering questions from the audience. "What do you hope readers take away from your story?" someone asked. Miles glanced at Nia before answering. "That it's never too late to start healing, and that you don't have to do it alone." The crowd erupted into applause, but the most meaningful moment came later, when a young woman approached them with tears in her eyes. "Your book made me feel seen," she said. Nia and Miles exchanged a look, both of them silently acknowledging that this was the reason they'd taken the leap. The buzz from the book launch lingered for weeks, opening doors neither Nia nor Miles had imagined. Requests for interviews, panel discussions, and podcast appearances poured in. While thrilling, the whirlwind of attention brought new challenges. For Nia, the constant exposure felt overwhelming. She'd spent so much of her life in the shadows that being in the spotlight was jarring. One evening, she confessed to Miles, "I don't know how to handle all of this. People expect me to have it all figured out, but I don't." Miles, ever grounded, replied, "You don't have to be perfect, just be real. That's what got us here in the first place." Miles, on the other hand, struggled with the idea of being a public figure. He was used to being behind the scenes, mentoring kids, and focusing on small, meaningful moments. At a live Q&A, an audience member asked him, "Do you see yourself as a role model now?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, then answered honestly, "I think I'm just a guy trying to figure things out, like everyone else. If sharing my story helps someone, that's enough for me." As the book gained traction, its impact began to ripple through their communities. At the youth center, Miles noticed a shift. The boys he mentored started opening up more, sharing pieces of their own struggles. One day, a quiet teenager named Jordan approached him after a session. "Your book? It made me realize it's okay to talk about stuff," Jordan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Miles felt a lump in his throat. "I'm glad it helped. Talking is the first step." Nia received an email from a woman in Atlanta who'd started a support group inspired by the book. "We meet every week," the email read. "Your words gave us the courage to face our truths together." Reading it, Nia felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Their story was no longer just theirs, it belonged to everyone who found healing through it. The success of the book didn't erase their personal struggles, but it gave them tools to navigate them. Nia started seeing a therapist again, realizing that her journey was ongoing. In one session, she admitted, "I used to think healing had an endpoint. Now I know it's a process." Her therapist smiled. "That's the most important lesson of all." Miles reconnected with his mother, their relationship evolving in ways he hadn't thought possible. One afternoon, they sat on her porch, sorting through old family photos. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Hearing those words, Miles felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. With the proceeds from the book, Nia and Miles decided to create a foundation focused on mental health awareness in Black communities. They named it The Courage Within, a tribute to the strength it took to share their stories. The foundation funded therapy scholarships, community workshops, and storytelling initiatives, ensuring that others had access to the resources they once lacked. While the book remained a cornerstone of their lives, both Nia and Miles began exploring new creative outlets. Nia started hosting poetry retreats, helping others find their voices through writing. Miles began filming a documentary about his mentoring program, capturing the stories of the boys he worked with. Through these projects, they continued to grow, their lives intertwined but still distinct. Years later, at a speaking event for The Courage Within, a young man raised his hand during the Q&A. "What's next for you two?" he asked. Nia and Miles exchanged a smile. "We keep going," Nia said simply. "Healing is a journey, not a destination." "And we keep helping others find their way," Miles added, "because that's what it's all about." The applause that followed was deafening, but what stayed with them were the quiet conversations afterward. The people who approached them with tears in their eyes, thanking them for being brave enough to share their truth. Their story wasn't just about them anymore. It was a testament to the power of vulnerability, connection, and the courage it takes to face the darkest parts of yourself. The impact of Nia and Miles's book extended far beyond their immediate circles, reaching individuals from all walks of life. Each person who picked it up found something different within its pages, a reflection of their own struggles, a source of inspiration, or a call to action. Jordan, the quiet teenager from the youth center, found himself drawn to Miles's story. For years, he'd buried his emotions, convincing himself that showing vulnerability was a sign of weakness. One day, he approached Miles after a mentoring session. "I started journaling like you talked about in the book," he said, hesitating. Miles smiled, nodding. "How's that going for you?" "Hard," Jordan admitted, "but good too. It's like I'm finally saying things I didn't think I could." Months later, Jordan volunteered to lead a discussion group for younger boys at the center, using what he'd learned to help others. Erica, a single mother in her late 30s, discovered the book after a friend recommended it. She had always felt trapped by the weight of her own childhood trauma, unsure how to raise her two daughters without repeating the patterns she'd grown up with. In one particularly poignant chapter, Nia wrote about forgiving herself for not being perfect. That sentiment struck a chord with Erica. She emailed Nia, sharing her story. "Your book helped me see that I don't have to be flawless to be a good mom," Erica wrote. "I just have to show up every day and do my best." Nia responded personally, encouraging Erica to seek therapy and reminding her of the strength it took to even acknowledge her fears. Erica later started a parenting support group in her community, helping other mothers navigate the complexities of healing while raising children. Malik was a 50-year-old man who'd spent decades avoiding the unresolved pain of losing his father to violence. He stumbled upon the book at a local bookstore, skeptical at first, but something about Miles's journey resonated with him, particularly the chapter about grief and the fear of confronting it. After finishing the book, Malik decided to visit his father's grave for the first time since the funeral. Standing there, he felt a wave of emotions he'd spent years suppressing. Later, he joined a local grief support group, sharing his story for the first time. "That book gave me the push I needed," Malik said during one meeting. Tanisha, a 22-year-old college student, had always loved writing but never shared her work out of fear of judgment. When she attended one of Nia's poetry retreats, she brought a battered notebook filled with poems she'd never let anyone read. During a sharing circle, Tanisha finally mustered the courage to recite a piece about her struggles with identity and self-worth. Her voice shook, but the applause afterward was thunderous. "Your words matter," Nia told her. "Don't ever doubt that." Inspired, Tanisha started performing at open mic nights on her campus and eventually published a chapbook of her poetry. Each person touched by the book carried their own burdens, but what united them was the realization that they weren't alone. At a panel discussion hosted by the Courage Within Foundation, a young woman in the audience stood up during the Q&A. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Reading your book made me realize it's okay to not be okay. It gave me the courage to reach out for help." Afterward, she approached Nia and Miles, tears streaming down her face. "You don't know me, but you saved my life." Miles placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved your life. We just showed you it was possible." As time passed, Nia and Miles began to see the broader impact of their work. The people they'd touched went on to touch others, creating a ripple effect of healing and connection. The parenting group Erica started grew into a citywide initiative, offering free workshops and counseling services for families. Jordan's discussion group at the youth center expanded, with boys who once avoided vulnerability now leading sessions for others. Malik became an advocate for mental health awareness in his community, organizing events to break the stigma around seeking help. Tanisha's poetry inspired a movement on her campus, with students forming a collective to use art as a tool for healing. One evening, Nia and Miles sat together at a cafe, reflecting on how far they'd come. "Sometimes I wonder if we're really making a difference," Nia admitted. Miles gestured toward a bulletin board nearby, where a flyer for the Courage Within was pinned. "I think the answer is all around us." She smiled, her heart full. "I guess you're right." Their book had started as a way to process their own pain, but it had grown into something so much bigger, a testament to the power of vulnerability and the strength found in community. Months after the success of their book and the growth of the Courage Within, Nia and Miles found themselves standing at another crossroads. The foundation was thriving, but both felt an itch to expand their horizons even further. "I think I want to go back to school," Nia announced one evening as they worked on plans for a new community workshop. Miles looked up, surprised. "For what?" "Psychology," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "I want to be a therapist. Writing the book made me realize how much I want to help people in a more personal, hands-on way." "That's amazing," Miles said, his smile wide. "You'd be great at it." "What about you?" Nia asked. "What's next for Miles the mentor?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "I've been thinking about opening a permanent center, someplace bigger than what we have now. A space for kids, adults, anyone who needs a place to feel safe." Nia reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You're building legacies, Miles. I love that." Enrolling in a master's program was daunting, but Nia threw herself into her studies with the same determination that had driven her to write. Her evenings were now filled with textbooks and case studies, her days spent running workshops for the foundation. One of her professors, Dr. Anita Russell, became a mentor. "You have a gift for connecting with people," Dr. Russell told her after a class discussion on trauma therapy. Nia smiled. "I think it's because I've been where they are. I know how it feels to feel stuck." Meanwhile, Miles began scouting locations for his new community center. With the help of grants and donations from the foundation, he secured an old warehouse in his neighborhood. Renovating the space became a passion project. He envisioned classrooms, counseling rooms, an art studio, and even a small theater. When he shared his plans with the kids at the youth center, their excitement was contagious. "We're going to call it the Safe Haven," he told them during a brainstorming session. Jordan, now one of his trusted volunteers, grinned. "That sounds perfect." Despite their new ventures, Nia and Miles made time for each other, their bond continuing to deepen. They leaned on one another during challenging moments and celebrated every small victory together. One night, after a long day of renovations at the Safe Haven, Miles invited Nia over to see the progress. Walking through the half-finished space, she marveled at his vision. "You're building something incredible here," she said. He leaned against a freshly painted wall, looking at her. "So are you. We're both taking what we've been through and turning it into something good." She nodded, her heart full. "It's a reminder that we're more than our pasts." A year later, they hosted a joint event to celebrate the grand opening of the Safe Haven and Nia's graduation from her master's program. The event was packed with community members, supporters, and even some of the people whose lives had been changed by their book. Nia gave a speech about the importance of facing one's fears and embracing growth, her voice steady and confident. Miles followed with a heartfelt message about the power of Black community. "None of us are meant to do this alone," he said. "Healing happens when we come together." As the crowd erupted in applause, Nia and Miles stood side by side, their journeys intertwined yet still distinct. Over time, their work continued to evolve. Nia became a licensed therapist, specializing in trauma and resilience. She opened her own practice where she combined traditional therapy with creative writing workshops. Miles expanded the Safe Haven into a network of centers across the city, each one offering resources and support for people of all ages. Through it all, they remained each other's strongest supporters, partners in purpose and in life. One quiet evening, as they sat on Nia's porch, sipping tea and watching the sun set, she turned to Miles. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. He smiled, his gaze thoughtful. Every day, and I can't wait to see where we go next. Nia reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. And with that, they sat in peaceful silence, knowing that their journey was far from over, but confident in the strength they'd built, individually and together, to face whatever came next.